What I'd like to show you is an illustration of how applied neuroaxiology works. Now may look like a rather complicated illustration, but in practice what's happening is really simple for you to apply in your life. So let's take a look at how habits work, how you can change them, and how you can transform your thinking and your life through the principles and practices that we teach you in your First Steps Assessment Report. First, let's take a look at how habits work, automatic ways of reacting. Now, in your First Steps report, you have two primary challenges or weaknesses. I'm going to show you 3 examples of how this works so you get a good idea of the process that takes place. Now, associated with every set of thoughts, every way of thinking, is a set of neuropathways, a set of neurons and axons and synaptic connections, and we'll just call them generally neuropathways. So for every one of them, there's a set of neuropathways associated in your brain with these perspectives, these ways of thinking. Now what happens if you're in a situation and something triggers you, a stimulus? For example, if someone says, "You're wrong," well, what happens? What really goes on in the mind so quickly and so fast if our habits are running the show? Well, if one of your challenges is a low VQ pertaining to considering possibilities, then you're going to have a certain perception that results in an automatic reaction. For example, instead of considering possibilities, you might react with, "No, I'm right and they're wrong." And this triggers an emotion or a way of being defensive. Or another example, instead of addressing obstacles, somebody tells you you're wrong, you may instead go, "Oh, why is everything such a battle?" And you just feel frustrated. Or a third example, when somebody says you're wrong and you're not very good at acknowledging your assets, you might get dejected by thinking, I'm not good enough. I'm wrong. Everybody thinks I'm wrong. Somehow I'm just not good enough. Clearly, these ways of thinking aren't going to help you create the maximum amount of value, joy, happiness, and effectiveness that you might want to have in your life. In fact, these are the sources of most of the stress and upset, frustration and conflict and overwhelm that you have in your life. And I'll bet you'd rather not have that much. I'll bet you'd rather have some good things happen in your life, and you'd rather find ways to make your mind work in such a way that you access your strengths and you start to think in ways that help you to create greater value and success in your life. Well, let's look at how you can have some freedom around this. Let's see how you can be empowered around this. Let's look at how choices work. So, going back to our stimulus, "You're wrong," the automatic way of reacting, faster than anything, is you might go to, "I'm right, they're wrong, why is everything a battle?" Get frustrated, dejected, "I'm not good enough." Well, if you happen to notice that that's happening, there is something you can do about it in the moment. You can shift your perspective. And what you have in your First Steps report associated with your primary strength is what we call a centering question. Now, in your First Steps report, you only have one of your primary strengths, but I'm going to give you 3 examples again to illustrate how this works. Associated with your high VQ strengths, and by the way, in your full VQ profile with all 36 measurements, there's a good chance you have far more than one. But let's look at a possible 3. Through the use of centering questions, you will trigger and fire up a different set of neuropathways. For example, if one of your strengths is seeking common ground, a centering question will have you look at what the other person's perspective of. Even though they said you were wrong, you may look at, well, what is their perspective? Not just that I'm wrong, but what's wrong? What aren't they seeing? And in this way, you become more empathetic. Or a centering questions associated with the strength of improving things has to do with looking, well, what's really the priority? Rather than going into a battle, you're looking at what's the priority here? And in that way, you'll be much more intentional rather than just frustrated. And if valuing yourself is one of your primary strengths, and you ask that centering question, you'll start to think about, well, what can I learn here? You'll start to become more curious, because if this is your strength, you know you can learn. It has nothing to do with whether you're good enough or not, and there's no need to become dejected. You see, when you use these centering questions, and when you're over on the right-hand side of the screen here, what's over on the left-hand side becomes irrelevant. And you start to no longer use and react in the same way that you did in the past. And over time, the more you do this, the more often you ask centering questions to shift your perspective to an area of strength, the more, through a process called synaptic pruning, some of those axons and neurons and neural pathways will become weaker. The synapses will literally be pruned out of your brain. And over time, those challenges will start to fade away. They'll no longer be your habitual way. And you'll have strengthened your strengths. You'll have developed new habits that are anchored in the most brilliant thinking that you've got. In fact, over time, some of your low VQs will improve as well, and they can become strengths. And so through this process, you've transformed your thinking. You're no longer at the mercy of your old habits of mind that get you into trouble, and instead, you're tapping into your primary strengths. And all that's needed is to learn how to recognize when you're at risk and use your centering questions to shift your perspective into your high VQ strengths. And in that way, you will transform your life.